Well, thank you, Michelle. And hello, everyone. And thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for inviting me to be here, but most importantly for inviting all of you, inviting the community to come in and learn about some of these issues that are facing the community, because I have every confidence when you take that knowledge into the voting booth, we're going to be just fine. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So who am I, and what do I have to offer to this conversation? And really, for me personally, I think when I've thought about why am I passionate about this issue and why do I think it's so important, and I look back to how I grew up and my family story. My dad was enlisted in the Air Force, so I was born in Wiesbaden. We moved when I was rather young. But I've lived all over the world in all different kinds of housing. I've lived in multifamily, I've lived in garden style, I've lived in single family, I've lived in high rise, I've lived in European style flat, I've lived in different kinds of neighborhoods, I've lived in segregated neighborhoods, I've lived in integrated neighborhoods, I've lived really, I feel very blessed in the kind of life that I've lived. There's little asterisks on Copenhagen because I've never actually lived there, but I've spent quite a bit of time there. My mom is Danish, and actually the family and I, we just got back a couple weeks ago. It was hard to come back, to be quite honest. We spent 2 weeks there this summer. And of course, now I'm in Arlington. And of all those places, what do you think my favorite place is? It's Arlington. I love it here. So glad to be here. So, as Michelle pointed out, we're talking about, when we talk about missing middle, we're talking about not only housing forms, but also who is being left out of the housing market. And we're thinking primarily in this conversation about ownership opportunities for those in the middle class, commonly defined as 80 to 120% of area median income. So roughly making in that range of 65 to 140K. And what does that mean? What can you afford? Somewhere between 250 to 600K. So that's kind of, if you're thinking about, well, what are we talking about in the sweet spot, if you will? And these are rough numbers, so there could definitely, there's really a continuum here, a spectrum, but that's the sweet spot. So think in your mind right now, what in Arlington is affordable for 250 to 600K? That's about what you're looking at, right? Michelle went over some of the numbers that really dive into the data, but I think that this slide speaks volumes. That we have since 2010, we've added over 8,000 of those multifamily high-rise, which are fine for a certain segment of the population. For some folks, that's okay, obviously, because we sell them and we rent them pretty much as fast as we can build them. And then you look over there in terms of what's been, and most of it's rental, obviously, by the way, in the blue. And we look over there and we see 90 new net single-family homes, which are obviously just those few remaining lots where the one house comes down and two or more go up in its place, where they're being subdivided. That's the only way you're getting any net new single-family. We are not going to add single-family stock, detached single-family stock to Arlington. It's all used up. So, when I think about where I've lived around the world, what reminds me most is Fairlington. Anybody here live in Fairlington? No Fairlington in the house. I love Fairlington. I think if we had 10 more Fairlingtons, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But we don't, and we don't have the land to make 10 more Fairlingtons. So what I challenge folks to think about, when you think about what do we love about Fairlington, what do I love about Fairlington? You've got the sense of community. You have the safety and security. You have neighbors know each other, right? Somebody's looking out for the senior citizen next door or across the way if they might be in trouble or if they need help preparing for a hurricane, for crying out loud. Somebody's looking out if you weren't able to get home from work on time and you know your kid's getting off the bus, you got somebody to call who you know you can be there. It's a safe community. Place for kids to play. Place for the community to gather together. Just a sense of well-being, and that to me is what neighborhoods are all about. They're not necessarily about white picket fence and your own little postage stamp of grass, although for some that's nice to have. So couldn't have the presentation even though Michelle had it. This is the quintessential slide. This is the very definition. What I would argue is most important when we look at this slide and we think about what can Arlington do and what does this problem really mean for Arlington, think we've well established that we have the detached single-family homes, and we've got the mid and the high-rise on the other end. It's recognizing the diversity of missing middle housing forms, some of which, as Michelle said, we do have townhouses, although in Dan Paralek's defense, Michelle, notice that there's no garage doors on those townhomes, and all the luxury townhomes we get in Arlington have garage doors, and you're going to see in a little bit why that's important. So just notice all the different kinds of living, and for those who've been around the world or in other parts of even the country or just elsewhere, and thinking about all the different kinds of housing types there are that we just don't have here, and ask yourself, why don't we have them here? So, why don't we have them here? Well, cost of land. And of all these factors that are on here, cost of land is, I would submit, is the one we can't really do anything about. Ironically enough, the harder we try, the better we do as a community in responding to our challenges, the more that we make this awesome place that everyone wants to be. Obviously, that's going to just continue to drive up land values. So we have to accept that. We have to accept that we're a victim of our own success, and land is very, very expensive. But that's not the end of the story. There are other things that we can do. So zoning regulations. It is true that our zoning ordinance, the bulk of it, the gist of it was adopted in 1951. It has a legacy of segregation. That was the main driver behind this notion of how are we going to make sure that our neighborhoods are protected from those that were considered to be less desirable. And not just those, but not just those that were here, but those that might come in. And I think of my own house in Lyon Park, and I know from some of my elderly neighbors that in the 1940s, the house was split up and the upstairs was a separate apartment. So during the wartime, we know that that's true all over Arlington. Now that would be illegal. And that's because of this legacy of segregation inherent in our zoning ordinance. And it's fundamentally still single-family oriented. So we, through the wisdom of our county board, back in the 1970s and through the 80s and on into the modern era, we have updated the zoning ordinance as it applies to our major planning corridors. So primarily the metro corridors and Columbia Pike. And we are just beginning now and looking at the Lee Highway corridor. So that's a huge opportunity. But we have not really touched the zoning ordinance as it relates to single-family neighborhoods, and we've got to bite off that apple and look at that. The other major drivers, parking requirements, they are extremely cost prohibitive, and they are a huge driver of housing of all types. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And finally, what I call the herd mentality of home builders. That missing middle is not exactly a proven concept. In some areas, in some parts, there's great success stories. But around here, it's not. And so if you ever wonder why the real estate market is such a boom-bust cycle, it's because of the way the whole thing is set up. When developers go in and they want to get financing, if they could go to a bank and they can say, well, Jimmy next door, he built exactly this, it looked exactly like that, it cost exactly this much to build, they sold it for exactly this much, they made this much money, and I'm going to do the exact same thing, and the bank says, that sounds great, here you go. If you want to go in and you want to say, I got this great new idea, and I think I'm going to do this, that, and the other, the banks are like, whoa, hold on a second. I've got this other guy over here who wants to do something that I know is going to give me a return. So we have to deal with that, because predictability and certainty is part of the equation that the county has a role to play in helping our developer community to figure out how to bust through this. And we've done that in the past, by the way. Michelle mentioned garden-style apartments. Arlington was the birthplace of garden-style apartments. So we were the innovators of a major housing forum that swept the nation. We can do it again. So I'm going to ask you, is this what we want? This is the effect of our zoning ordinance. This is entirely consistent with the zoning ordinance. Every one of these, everything that you see in this picture is exactly what our zoning ordinance pretty much calls for. So if we don't want this anymore, and it might have been completely right and appropriate for a certain era, a certain time where we were, but if this is not what we want the future of Arlington to be, we have to change the ordinance that dictates that this is what we're going to get. Why is it still that way? Think about it. Lee Highway has the demographics to die for. Every retailer, every developer, it's all there. It's got to be one of the wealthiest corridors in the entire nation. And there are definitely parts of it that we all love, and there's certainly retailers and local businesses that I personally love. But fundamentally, it has not grown and evolved and adapted and changed, and that is fundamentally because the zoning ordinance not only does not allow it, but worse yet, doesn't encourage it, doesn't incentivize it. We have to do better. Who knows where this is? Michelle? Anyone? Recognize it? This is Lacey Woods. Why did that developer do that? Because that's what the zoning ordinance says he can do. That's what he was allowed to do, and there were very limited options. It would have been extraordinarily expensive to try to do something else. Unproven. So what's he going to do? He doesn't have a proven concept. He's going to go with that's the proven concept. I don't know, but I'm guessing he probably did just fine. He probably made lots of money on those houses. And I'm sure the people that bought them are great families and nice people. But is that really what we want? Can we do better? And I think the answer is absolutely. So there's an opportunity here. We are a transit-rich community in general, and we can focus on where transit is when we talk about missing middle housing. I wouldn't take these numbers as gospel. This is very generic information. But what I would offer to you is that there is a very direct relationship in what's called the Housing Plus Transportation Affordability Index. No matter how much money you make or have to spend on your housing, you can always get more housing the further out you go, right? If you buy a $2 million house in Lion Village today, next door to, thank you, Senator Favola, for joining us. I know your house is not worth $2 million, but if you buy a $2 million house in Lion Village, you could take that $2 million and go out to McLean and get a bigger house, more land. It's always true no matter what. But what are you doing if you go out there? You've got more commuting costs. You're spending time in commuting. It affects quality of life. What we have in Arlington here is we have this opportunity for a transit-rich experience, and that shifts the equation when we talk about household budgets and opportunities. But it is all based on transit. So because the table's in the way, I'm going to read this, the caption here for you. I don't reimburse, I validate, I listen and acknowledge how difficult it was for you to find a place to park. So parking is one of the central issues. When we start really planning for Lee Highway, parking is going to be big, because I heard it, and we've all heard it in the early conversations about the visioning for Lee Highway. Some folks just, it's because of how they've lived so far. It's because of, for a variety of factors, and there's not a wrong or right necessarily, but there is judgments and opportunities that either we are going to take or we are not. And that has to do with, some folks want to say, well, I love my retail and I want great neighborhood stores, and I want to be able to walk to them if I want to, but I also want to be able to drive and park out front. And those are fundamentally, it's just not possible. Especially, remember, the one thing we can't change and control is the cost of land. And the cost of land for a surface parking is outrageous. In my view, it is a waste of money. It's not where we should be spending our resources. And for structured parking, to build underground parking is also very, very expensive. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to have any parking at all, but we need to have realistic conversations with each other about how much parking do we really need, and if we invest that money instead in transit and in walkability, is it possible that we can get to that place where we have the affordable communities that we want, with the walkability and the sense of security, a sense of place, and meet the needs that we have for a huge part of our population. So what are we doing right now about this? So I'm very excited because there are several initiatives that are already underway in our community planning, housing, and development staff. And one is the housing conservation districts and the tools that we are developing right now. We are starting to nibble on the zoning ordinance, and there will be opportunities there. I do believe, as Michelle mentioned, the board last year, before my time, so you can't hang me for it, the board did not pass all of the detached affordable dwelling unit ordinance, so that's going to come back around. As I mentioned, the Lee Highway study, and that I think is a really big opportunity. We're looking at our non-conforming single-family zoning. This also shows about how outdated the zoning ordinance is. That there is a huge percentage of, because that zoning was implemented after a good part of Arlington was already established, and it was overlaid on top of. So there are lots of houses, in particular if you're on a corner lot, where you don't meet the setback requirements from the corner. There are a lot of homes that your lot might have been, if you're in an R6 and it's supposed to be 6,000 square feet, maybe you have a 5,000 square foot lot. Lots of homes that are non-conforming, that are grandfathered, if you will. But what you can do under that non-conforming status is actually really quite constrained. And so therefore, it's an incentive for why, if it's really difficult to modernize that house because you're fighting against the stream, if you were trying to swim upstream against the zoning ordinance, well, we'll just sell the house, a builder comes in and tears it down, starts over from scratch. So that's really important. And we are certainly focusing on workforce housing. All of the things that we're trying to do in Arlington are simply not possible if we don't keep our economic engine going, and we have to make sure that we have the housing for the workforce of tomorrow that the employers of tomorrow are going to demand. So I challenge you, let's build a movement together. There is going to be lots of opportunity to talk about what does this mean for each of us. Housing is one of the most personal, I think, aspects. That's why I started out sharing with you where I've lived. Housing is so personal to each and every one of us, but yet our government, our local government, has a huge impact on what options are available to us. This is not something that is out of our reach. This is not something that is left to the developers. This is not something for the county board to solve. This is something that we have to solve, all of us working together. And I am convinced that we can find the solutions that are right for us, but we only do it when we're having conversations at our backyard barbecues, at our school events, when you're standing on the sidelines of the kids' soccer game, when you're at your church. Wherever you are, you're having conversations with your neighbors, and we're working to build a movement and bringing people together, then I know we can get it done. Thank you so much.